moment from the past. Storming Asilah. The rain subsided, and the wind dispersed the last of the clouds over the ocean. From the height of the tower towering over the wall of Asilah, a fortress along the ocean shore, Vizier Shadullah clearly saw the ships of the Portuguese fleet in the distance. Some vessels were lodged on coastal reefs as they continued to fall apart. The surviving ships lined up opposite the fortress, preparing to fire and fill it with holes. The infantrymen who managed to get to shore also gathered in detachments and began to surround the fortress. Their immense columns came from afar and were already walking toward the walls. Despite the recent rain, they raised clouds of dust. Looking closely at the soldiers, Shadullah saw that many of them did not wear any armor, and some even walked barefoot. There were so many of them that for one defender of the fortress and city, there were at least 5 enemies. The vizier looked at his soldiers, grimly waiting inside the fortress for the assault at the walls. Just yesterday, their faces were cheerful, and the city was living a quiet, peaceful life. But suddenly these Portuguese appeared, and the arrival took everyone by surprise. The city did not have time to prepare for this siege. Many of Asilah's soldiers abandoned their homes or posts at the news of the Portuguese landing and, neglecting their duty, ran away with the ordinary citizens before all the gates of the fortress were closed. Shadullah thought it was unlikely that the Portuguese would launch an assault immediately. He knew a lot about military affairs and that an assault is always preceded by a long siege. This would give the defenders of Asilah time to gather and strengthen their morale. Suddenly, however, the side of one of the ships was dotted with a number of small clouds, which were immediately blown away by the wind. Then the rumble of cannons reached the city. At the same time, cannonballs began to blow up the ground near the fortress, hit the walls, and fly over the heads of the defenders of Asilah. The Portuguese had still brought their terrible cannons. Peering into the distance, to where the ranks of cavalrymen were lined up behind the infantry lines, Shadullah saw soldiers assembling long ladders made from planks delivered from the ships. But why did they need these ladders now? Weren't they going to besiege the fortress first? Shadullah, whom Sheikh Muley had left in command of the Asilah garrison, began to clasp his cheeks in despair. Were they really going to storm immediately after they got off the ships? This should not happen this way. The position of the fortress defenders was rapidly becoming hopeless. Yes, he was not mistaken. The soldiers were there with ladders at the ready and on command, rushed forward to join the infantry already standing near the walls. Young Daniel, with his saber raised, was running towards the wall, his squad following behind. This was the vanguard of Afonso V, who, at that moment, was looking at them through a spyglass from the captain's bridge. Behind the assault squad, the king saw a large red horse, on which his son and heir to the throne, 16-year-old Joao, was sitting. The soldiers, inspired by Joao's presence, shouted with delight. However, the strong spiritual uplift did not prevent them from observing line position and order. They did not lag behind Daniel, who had received instructions from Joao before the attack detailing from which side and how the squad would storm Asilah. Despite Joao's youth, the courtiers had predicted he would have a career as a great general. His teachers were the best experts and masters of military affairs in Portugal. Under their guidance, he had already learned the basics of military science, and now the heir passed the final exam as he commanded this assault. Here the king's son caught Daniel's eye as he turned around and immediately pointed to the gate tower with his hand. Daniel gave the command to his sergeants and continued running toward the wall. Soldiers rushed in with ladders. With a running start, they leaned them against the walls and immediately divided into groups. Some climbed up while others held the ladders stable. Arrows, spears, stones, and construction debris collected for such an intrusion flew at them from above. But no matter what the defenders of the fortress threw at the Portuguese, No matter how they tried to push the ladders away with poles and pitchforks to prevent the soldiers from climbing the walls to the tower, their attempts were in vain. Daniel had almost reached the top edge of the wall when a stream of boiling water fell on the ladder. Fortunately for Daniel, the boiling water barely touched him. Only on his back, under his armored shell, it felt as if a scorpion's tail dug into his back. One of the soldiers climbing after the commander roared in pain.
"Don't take off your armor!"
Daniel bellowed, already putting his foot on the wall. A saber swung, and another, the Moors, who had rushed toward Daniel, backed away and leaned towards the crowd of comrades bristling with pikes and sabers. But the scalded, brutalized soldiers of Daniel's squad no longer registered anyone in front of them. Daniel barely managed to escape the swing of a halberd that crashed down on the nearest Moor. Uttering wild cries, his soldiers rushed along the fortress wall to the gate tower. New volleys of naval cannons thundered around them, and the towers began to crumble, their stones scattering together with the remains of the defenders of the fortress. Soon Daniel's squad was running from the wall and down the steps leading to the gate. Scattering stones and logs that supported the gate from the inside, they opened the doors. The cavalrymen waiting outside, who had completely covered themselves and their horses with armor, rushed into the fortress with pikes at the ready. It was simply impossible to restrain the onslaught of these muscles and steel.
"Long live the king!"
The cavalrymen shouted all together.
"Long live Joao! Rush ahead!"
The devastation brought upon the conquered city by Afonso's soldiers was terrible. The soldiers exterminated almost all living things that came their way, breaking into the mosque and finding where the wives, children, and mothers of the Moor warriors sought refuge. They killed everyone. Thousands of captured soldiers and citizens were surrounded by the Portuguese in the main square and awaited their fate there. They were destined to rebuild the city from the ruins half-starved, and then go to the slave markets of Portugal. The looting of the city continued for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, a messenger came to the tent of Captain Daniel, who had just barely managed to fall asleep after the terrible and unpredictably fast victory that frightened even himself.
"The king is waiting for you, Señor Daniel,"
he said briefly. Daniel rushed to the basin of water, but the messenger stopped him.
"His Majesty has ordered you to arrive as I find you."
Therefore, Daniel arrived in the middle of the square in the fortress with other officers in the same torn, sweat-soaked, and smoke-saturated clothes. To the right and left of them, on the dais, sat the king's entourage. Directly in front of Daniel, King Afonso V was sitting on the dais. Shadullah was kneeling in front of him with his hands tied behind his back. The vizier squinted his camel-looking eyes in pain but remained silent.
"Captain Daniel,"
the herald proclaimed.
"approach the king."
Daniel stepped forward and froze at the dais.
"What happened to your hand?"
The king asked loudly, pointing at the bandage on the captain's arm.
"A Moor on the wall managed to hit me before he fell down."
The king shook his head respectfully and continued.
"Daniel, tomorrow my son will be awarded his accolade. You fought bravely under him. The courage with which you led your men-at-arms to storm the fortress and open the gates for our cavalry ensured a quick victory. If it weren't for you, my son probably wouldn't have earned his knighthood in this campaign. Therefore, I have issued 2 decrees."
A young courtier ran down the steps of the dais. He handed Daniel 2 scrolls with red wax seals hanging on them. Daniel took the scrolls and saluted the king. He continued,
"Daniel, first of all, I'm appointing you Castellan of Leiria Fortress. Together with your family, you will receive an improved allowance there. You will also get ownership of a house with the right of inheritance. In addition to your share of the loot, you will also receive a special bonus from me."
The king swore under his breath, slapped his neck with a flourish, and killed a fat meat fly. The gaping page began to fan the king with redoubled zeal with a large fan.
"Secondly, your children will study for free at the University of Lisbon. Our army needs the descendants of soldiers like you. They should be not only brave soldiers, but also educated people. This is the content of my decrees.
Chapter 9. In the name of the king. Captain Stefan, the commander of the Vila Viçosa garrison, lifted his head from the pillow and listened. It was still early, but a discordant chorus of drunken soldiers could be heard from the barracks. They chanted in derision at the pot-bellied nobles and threatened to let the red rooster into the estates of the gentlemen and defame their wives and daughters. Only the name of the king remained sacred to them. Only the king was spared by the soldiers, and only on him did they continue to rely. The worst thing was that the soldiers delivered their blasphemous speeches in rhyme. They didn't even invent anything special. They just twisted the words of the drill song, and, of course, a once-uttered obscenity is impossible to get out of your head. Stefan knew this from his own experience. Last night, when Stefan didn't find a single sentry on the castle wall, he looked into the barracks, and even the duty sergeant didn't come up to him with a report. Only one, the drunkest but somewhat obedient soldier, tried to get up, and even that was out of some force of habit. What else, damn it? What next? Stefan knew well that the army was rotten from the inside and falling apart. After 1 or 2 days of idleness, the first cracks would start on even the strongest shelf. One soldier, then another, would stop shaving or mending his clothes and armor. Then, the sullen grumbling of the most irrepressible troublemakers would begin. These would be silently supported by the majority, some agreeing and others following because they were afraid of these loudmouths. There may be only 3 or 4 of them, but they would have strong fists and a habit of keeping everyone down. They liked to fight, which most, on the contrary, did not like at all despite their trade. A week later, a soldier's revolt would become inevitable, turning the regiment into a huge gang of looters and rapists, terrifying civilians. Once it began, it could only be brought to obedience with the help of regiments that had not yet been touched by corruption, and there was already one such regiment, camped just outside these castle walls. My God, while he, the commandant, was fussing with his secret, the soldiers had already guessed everything, that there would be no assault, and the Duke had fled. He was left alone with his lies and looked at the ground. After all, the whole garrison had eyes. Everything the soldiers saw, they would freely discuss. The red line had already been crossed. He, the captain and commandant, would not be able to hang even one soldier perjurer to impose fear, because he simply would not find any amenable performers. Stefan imagined being pushed out into the street, into a crowd of drunken soldiers. Everyone was angry at him for some reason or another. Such was military service. Everyone kept a stone in his bosom. The soldiers angrily shouted righteous words. They made up a terrible, criminal untruth, but the crowd was unable to see through it, and finally, a noose was thrown around his neck. For the first time in days, Stefan felt goosebumps running down his spine. He couldn't help the Duke anymore. He was no longer able to carry out his orders. Neither the Duke nor his family was in any danger. Yes, the treasurer continued to regularly give both soldiers and him huge sums in gold cruzados, but sooner or later the supplies would run out, and then they wouldn't be able to buy half a dead rat for those damn cruzados. Stefan remembered how the superintendent shouted at another captain right in front of his eyes. When the officer tried to justify himself by referring to an order he received, the superintendent retorted, "That's why they made you an officer, so that you could decide for yourself which order to carry out and which not. He meant you had to get yourself out of predicaments." And Stefan started packing. He had prepared simple peasant clothes in advance, reasoning that they would protect him better than any armor at this point. Stefan just put the armor under the bed, and from there he took out a heavy bag of gold. Stefan took only a dagger for his weapon. Now he had to wait until dark. To reach the entrance to the underground passage, which only he knew about in the castle, it would be necessary to cross the square, where drunken soldiers were walking around now. Stefan didn't want to meet them at all, not in his captain's attire, but even more so not in his current dress. Finally, darkness enveloped the castle. Now it was dispelled only by the flames of the fire on which the soldiers were roasting the last mutton from the remaining stock in the kitchen and washing it down with precious wines from the Duke's already looted cellar. Stefan chose the moment when another barrel was being rolled out onto the square. The soldiers, shouting drunkenly, gathered around it, gave unwanted advice to the sergeant, kicking the bottom out of the barrel, and pushed each other away. A fight started. One after another, soldiers fell on the cobblestones but then got up and stubbornly crawled back toward the barrel. Stefan, holding a bundle in one hand and a stick in the other, sauntered past them to the temple. Creaking open the iron door, he went inside, and once there, pulled on a large icon in the lower tier of the altar that opened a secret door. Entering the altar, he confidently took a few steps to the northeast, bent down to the floor, groped for a large wooden hatch, pulled it up and descended the steps. Once at the bottom, Stefan took out a tar-soaked rag from his bundle and impaled it on the stick. He then took out a flint and began to strike sparks. Soon the underground passage was illuminated by the flame of the torch. Jorge first sensed the smell of burnt tar, and then he heard footsteps coming from the same place, from the underground passage. He got ready. The trapdoor cover lifted, and a head appeared in the light of the oil lamps. Jorge threw a silk cord around the stranger's neck and pulled at its ends. A minute later, it was all over. Jorge pulled his victim out of the hatch and immediately, without delay, transferred the body to a cart standing at the stable gate. 2 bodies were already lying on the cart. Jorge did not even take time to look at the face of this new victim. He went back to the hatch, bolted it, and extinguished the lamps. Then he threw hay over the bodies, opened the gate, slapped his palm on the rump of Perito's stallion, who snorted with fear and shame for the actions of these people, jumped into the cart, and drove out of the stable. His journey under the starry sky was a short jaunt to the river. That was the Duke's order. Duke de Braganza did not give any directives concerning the gold cruzados, so Jorge kept those for himself. The day eventually came when there was nothing left to eat or drink. The soldiers broke down the door to Stefan's apartment but found only the abandoned armor there. The captain had escaped. The patrol riders who regularly made rounds of the castle could not believe their eyes when the de Braganza family flag fell at the feet of their horses. They raised their heads and made sure that it was the same flag that used to hang on the keep. There was no flag there. The fallen flag was brought to General Afonso, and he immediately left for the castle. When he got to the wall, there were ranks of soldiers on it.
"Where is the Duke?"
The adjutant of the general shouted.
The Duke has disappeared.
They answered from the wall.
"Where is the Castellan then?"
Also disappeared.
One of the soldiers of the garrison shouted. With that, he threw down Stefan's armor.
"Who can General Afonso talk to?"
Let him talk to all of us. We're all in this together.
"Open the gate." "But no trickery, otherwise our bombards will talk."
And what will happen to us?
After some debate, the soldiers of General Afonso were allowed to enter the castle. The general spoke with 2 officers of the garrison who had come out of their shelters after seeing the king's soldiers in the castle. The general, on behalf of Joao, promised forgiveness to everyone. Afonso's soldiers began to search the castle in the hope of finding the Duke, but their efforts were in vain. Neither the Duke nor his family, not even his servants, were found in the castle. In the end, Afonso realized that the Duke had managed to escape the castle in secret, unbeknownst even to his officers and soldiers. How did he do it? Afonso contemplated this, although it no longer mattered. He could not complete his task, and the Duke had disappeared. Afonso was unable to capture and execute him. Having assessed the situation, the general decided to immediately send a messenger to the king with this news. Afonso himself had to restore order in the castle, assemble a new garrison for its defense, and only after that go back to Lisbon. For King Joao II, the most trying days of his entire reign had just begun. He assembled a council of the remaining generals in Lisbon and worked out a plan of action with them. Messengers were sent all over the country with a common decree for all. In the name of the king, every castellan and every commander of a garrison, regiment, ship, or border guard detachment, as well as every customs official, were tasked with capturing Duke de Braganza and delivering him alive to the royal court. Now Joao II wanted to personally execute the Duke and make sure that this time the Duke would not be able to run away. In addition, copies of the edict were sent to the Cortes, in which the king declared de Braganza a traitor to the kingdom and a troublemaker. Every subject of the king who dared to grant the Duke asylum was henceforth threatened with execution and deprivation of property, regardless of his rank, wealth, or nobility of family. The members of the Cortes had to sign off that they had familiarized themselves with the edict and notified their communities about the pursuit of Braganza. For the most slow-witted, the king established a reward for the apprehension, or any information leading to the apprehension, of Duke de Braganza. The king also sent a messenger to Queen Isabella of Castile with a request not to give refuge to de Braganza if he came to her. However, Isabella, with all due respect to Joao II, was in no hurry to answer. Heeding the messenger's pleas, Isabella received him in the throne room, sitting next to her husband Ferdinand of Aragon. This distraction did not tear the queen away from her favorite occupation, embroidery in frames. Isabella listened to the broken speech of the messenger, who read the letter of Joao II to the end, looked at her husband, and bowed her head to bite the thread.
Your Majesty,
She mumbled.
have you heard anything about this Braganza?
Ferdinand did not answer, but shrugged his shoulders and began to look at the ceiling, covered with Arabic script and ornaments.
Neither have I.
They were a worthy couple. The Castilian monarchs were second cousins to each other, but despite the remoteness of the relationship, they were similar in appearance. Each had the same rounded, even puffy face, and a similar outline of the eyes. However, unlike the potato nose on Ferdinando's face, the queen's nose looked more like a bird's beak. Her hair, hidden under a helmet-like white cape and a veil of transparent fabric, was the color of straw, whereas Ferdinand was black-haired. The queen was wearing her usual dress of blue silk embroidered with gold patterns. This color didn't go well with the queen's greenish-blue eyes. However, the same could be said about the almost satanic combination of Ferdinando's black eyes and his red clothes. The queen admired the azure cornflower she had just finished embroidering and sighed. De Braganza's wife and children were already living in one of the country palaces of the Castilian monarchs. But in his letter, Joao II did not ask about the Duke's family. The Duke himself was not in Castile. He was still in Portugal, which Isabella also knew. However, the Queen had no desire to quarrel with Joao II. He could get angry and, for example, order his fleet to block the exit from the Mediterranean Sea through the Estrecho de Gibraltar. Castile, weakened by the centuries-old Reconquista and recent wars with Portugal, would hardly be able to achieve success at sea now. The alliance of Portugal with England added convincing arguments against a quarrel with Joao II. In any case, such a quarrel would be costly.
So, what do you say, Your Majesty?
Isabella turned to her husband again. He shrugged again and said,
First of all, the beneficent King Joao II is our relative.
It was a stretch, but Joao II could be considered a relative of the Castilian monarchs. In his second marriage, Afonso V was married to Joanna la Beltraneja, Isabella's half-sister. Therefore, Joanna was Joao II's stepmother.
And we must,
Ferdinand continued,
respect his request.
Tell the king that as soon as Braganza appears in our domain, we will immediately consider this request.
The queen told the messenger.
Paco!
I'm here, Your Majesty.
The queen's secretary approached the throne.
Prepare a letter from the Castilian monarchs with an answer to His Majesty Joao II.
Yes, Your Majesty.
Isabella and her husband exchanged glances. They understood each other perfectly. The last wars against Castile in 1476 and 1479 were carried out by Afonso V precisely because he defended the illegitimate Joanna's right to the Castilian throne. Both wars brought him bad luck, but now the monarchs felt they should not stir up the past. However, in the event of a new war, de Braganza, if he finds himself in Castile, may even be very useful to influence the stubborn Joao II. The Castilian monarchs loved the purported persecuted Christians. But they loved their money even more, and they knew de Braganza had a lot of money. After Daniel's visit to the Cinta estate, the exercises at the Big Turtle continued for another day. When Daniel returned with his squad to Leiria, he first yelled at Lieutenant Furtado, the commander of the garrison, who was sitting in the fortress with the rest of the soldiers. There seemed to always be a reason for this, but today it was a prisoner who was caught on the shore. Daniel met Furtado in the desk sergeant's room where this strange dark-skinned man, draped with shiny bracelets and chains interspersed with multicolored stones, was sitting on a bench right behind the sergeant. The prisoner dared to look directly at Daniel with his intelligent, shining eyes.
Why is he here?
Daniel shouted to the sergeant, pointing at the prisoner.
How do you know what he is contemplating? What if he attacks you from behind? Do you want a guard to be murdered like in Albufeira?
The duty sergeant stood at attention and eyed Daniel apprehensively.
Your Grace, he can't be treated like everyone else.
Furtado defended the sergeant.
I don't know who he is or where he's from, but he's wearing gold jewelry.
What?
Daniel approached the prisoner and yanked the chain from around his neck. The prisoner continued to look him straight in the eyes.
Damn it. It's really gold, and with stones, precious, I suspect.
Think for yourself what will happen if he falls into the hands of the soldiers down in the cells.
Furtado continued.
They have all been wounded and bloodied at the hands of Moors and dream of revenge.
So, put him in a separate dungeon.
Daniel shouted.
A jug of water for him. A loaf of bread. An armful of hay. And the gospel. That's it. Let him wait until I come.
Yes, senor. But he doesn't need the gospel, because he doesn't speak our language.
And what does he speak?
I don't know, and no one can understand him. He's a foreigner, that's for sure.
Send a messenger to our temple. Some new monk was recently sent to them there. They say he is skilled in languages.
Yes, senor.
So, what other urgent matters do we have?
Your Grace, you have a letter from the king.
And the attendant handed Daniel an envelope.
What? Why didn't you tell me this first?
Daniel roared. He opened the envelope and began to read the letter.
To capture Duke Fernando de Braganza.
Daniel blinked and read again.
To capture Duke.
He sat down on the desk chair. Then he read again.
To capture Duke.
Come on, let's go!
The voice of the lieutenant brought Daniel back to his world. Furtado kicked the prisoner up, twisted his arm behind his back, and led him out of the room. Daniel finally came to his senses. Without saying goodbye to Furtado, he ran out of the duty room and rushed to his office. There, Daniel read the letter to the end and reread it again. What the hell was to be done? Go back to Leandro's estate and grab de Braganza? Yes, because from the moment Daniel read the letter and failed to rush headlong to carry out the order, he himself became a criminal. Leandro is a witness that Daniel saw de Braganza. However, he was not introduced to the Duke, and in case anything goes awry, it could be possible for him to say he did not recognize the Duke. Therefore, he could safely wait for the Duke here in the fortress of Leiria if he should happen to come here. Daniel could possibly meet him on the high road, or the devil knows where else. That's when, if he failed to detain him, Daniel would have disobeyed the order, and Daniel really didn't want to carry out this order because to fulfill it meant involving Leandro in this matter. Then, of course, Daniel would have to capture him too because the decree says,
"Every subject of the king who dares to grant Duke de Braganza asylum will be deprived of property and life, regardless of his rank, wealth, or nobility of family."
Daniel reread the letter. Oh, these nobles! Why must they rebel against the only legitimate king? Of course, they should be executed for this. And he, Daniel, needed to capture not only de Braganza but also Don Leandro. Yes, but if he does so, Estela and Nuno's friendship will be over. A third possibility remained, to immediately return to Leandro's house and tell him about the king's order. Let him run with this duke wherever he desires. Daniel would turn away and not notice. He would delay for a day or two and only then realize the duke was missing. Go in pursuit of the duke. But Nuno and Estela. Suddenly Daniel's office seemed to be illuminated by the sun. As the smiling Estela entered through the open door,
"Hello, father."
"My daughter,"
Daniel exclaimed. He jumped up from the table and rushed to Estela. The daughter offered her forehead for a kiss and gently evaded the embrace of her father, who smelled of fire, sweat, and horse.
"I'm glad to see you again. Why don't you go home? I suppose you are probably tired after everything?"
"Oh, daughter.
Daniel could not find words for the feelings that were bursting from him now. For once, his daughter, who did not particularly give him her attention, came to him directly at the fortress.
How are you doing? What's new at the university? How's mother? How's Nuno?"
"Nuno is the most interesting of all,"
Stella said.
"At his house, in my former room, there is a wounded girl. I'm afraid she may be an accomplice of those criminals who attacked your soldiers. I already heard about the attack."
Estela took the scarlet ribbon from her sleeve and put it on the table.
"We found this piece of cloth where one soldier was killed and the other disappeared, and the wounded girl staying with Nuno recognized it. Perhaps she is involved in the murder of the soldier on Big Turtle. And also, she looks remarkably like the prisoner who was just led past me."
Daniel, even during Estela's childhood, was never surprised by her constant awareness. Estela's curiosity and inquisitiveness were boundless, as were her knowledge and memory. If she were a man, he thought, she would have no equal in the intelligent aristocratic society and would already be working as an envoy to other countries.
"Who hurt her?"
Daniel asked.
"I don't know. It doesn't matter. The important thing is that she is not from our area and speaks a language that no one can understand. Also, no one can agree whether she is possibly from the Moranos or Moriscos because of her dark hair and very, very strange clothes, just like your prisoner. When you see her, father, you will immediately want to take her into custody."
Stella said.
"I'm sure about it."
She added meaningfully. His daughter's wishes had always been Daniel's law.
"That's it. When this girl disappears, Nuno will realize that he made a huge mistake.
Stella thought.
He won't associate with criminals, and when this dark-colored girl goes to prison, she will be counted among criminals, and the ribbon will be proof of that. I'll help Nuno forget about her. Her room will be mine again. Only the feather bed will have to be changed, and we will have a happy time together again like before. Come home,"
Estela said to her father.
"I will ask my mother to prepare warm water, lunch, and a fresh bed for you."
With that, she left. Daniel continued to reason, and his thoughts were headed in exactly the direction that Estela had planned. She really knew a lot about diplomacy.
Leandro,
Daniel thought,
is acting in concert with the Duke, there is no doubt about that. The question is, did they not possibly organize all these incidents, the attack on the 2 soldiers at Big Turtle and the attack on the wagon train? Of course, they didn't need these soldiers themselves, but what if they were just unwelcome witnesses to bigger dealings? What if these attacks were only part of a coup d'etat that, judging by the tone of the royal letter, de Braganza was guilty of organizing? And was this coup already in full swing and occurring right here, right under my nose?
Ideas started to transform from a puzzle to a clear vision in Daniel's head.
If you don't know what to do, act according to the oath.
Daniel recalled the rule that he himself had hammered into the heads of soldiers for years. Indeed, this was really the most reasonable solution. Daniel jumped up and, despite the pain in his leg, bruised the day before by a horse's hoof, ran out into the yard. His orderly was just passing by.
Ricardo, tell Sergeant Laguerre to get the horses saddled again. Feed them and the soldiers. In half an hour we leave again. Go!
Then, Daniel was back on horseback, racing ahead of his soldiers. From time to time, midges flew into his mouth and Daniel spat. Estela would never be in that scoundrel's house again. She wouldn't entertain any friendship with Nuno anymore. His new girl recognized that ribbon. She didn't even pretend. Oh, you robber breed. Was it necessary to come up with such a thing, to encroach on the power of the king? And on the very land under Daniel's supervision, on the power of the king, on whose mercy the fate of Daniel and his family depended. The king. Daniel had always been loyal and would remain loyal until his last breath because the kings, both Afonso V and Joao II, always paid him an honest salary and rewarded him generously for special military labors. No, he was not a noble son who had gone berserk with fat. He's an officer, an old hack and an honest man, and he would not give his daughter to these troublemakers for abuse. Furtado watched the last horseman leave the fortress. It became quiet, and he went to his office apartment.
What has happened to the Castellan?
He asked himself.
Once again, he is not acting according to reason. People just returned from a hike, and he has dragged them somewhere else again. However, I could care less about the captain.
Furtado still had tasks ahead of him, but he, at 40 years old, the oldest lieutenant in Portugal, had almost nothing to look forward to. Soon he would have to retire and live on a paltry penny pension without a home of his own, without a wife, without a family. All of which Furtado once lost forever because he was quarrelsome, weak to wine, and a drunkard. Well, he would venture to change this. At home, Furtado opened the casket in which he kept his valuables and took out a tiny ceramic vessel, only about the size of a finger. He opened the stopper, brought the vessel to the window, and looked into it. There was something barely splashing at the bottom. That was enough. Even 1 drop was enough. He would add 1 drop. No, 2 drops, just to be sure, to the water of that dirty one who was dragged from the shore and just now taken to the dungeon. Once the prisoner took at least a sip, Furtado planned to take some of his jewelry. Not all of it, of course. Some would have to be left. Even 1 chain from the prisoner's neck would be enough for him for the rest of his life. Enough for Furtado to buy a small house with a garden, a vineyard, and a cellar with huge barrels inside. As for the prisoner, well, who would miss him, a runaway Marano or Morisco or whatever? If he were to die, everyone in the fortress would only cross themselves and care less, and after he has expired, there would no longer be a need to guard him. The fewer of them there were, the better. How many of these were found on the roads monthly?
Senior Commandant!
Someone shouted and suddenly knocked at the outside door. Furtado shuddered, abruptly put the cork back in place, and shoved the vessel into the casket.
Well, come in!
He shouted. The door opened a crack. The attendant was standing in the doorway, and next to him was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed youth dressed in a brown wool shirt. Furtado recognized him. It was the new monk expelled to the church of Leiria from Lisbon. They said he was a troublemaker. He didn't get along with his superiors. There was a blissful smile on the monk's face. His teeth protruded slightly.
This is Brother Pascal,
The attendant introduced the monk.
whom Senior Castellan ordered to be sent to interrogate that prisoner. They say he knows different languages. Would you like me to take Mont to the prisoner?